Welcome back to the YouTube home of Peter Pan lore and Peter Pan facts with me, your Peter Pan hobbyist and enthusiast, using my Peter Pan hobbyist enthusiast brain and knowledge to bring you fun facts, lore and trivia, talk about the world of the Neverland, the story of Peter Pan, and answer you guys' questions. Today we're continuing with one that was a question asked over on TikTok, and I'm going to do a full video essay form content on it because the more I think about it, the more I have to add to my answer. The question that was put to me was, what if Peter Pan was a girl? And the more I thought about it, the more I have to add to this answer. So here we go, a very long video form essay for you guys. So grab yourself a drink, grab yourself a snack. I have a feeling this might be a long one. Let's dive in. Things to note before we get into this video essay. So number one, I'm going to give the girl version of Peter Pan a name. I just feel like she deserves one and it makes it way more interesting than just saying the girl Peter rather than flicking back and forth between them all the time. So the girl version of Peter Pan is called Peony. So when I'm talking about the original lore, I will talk about Peter Pan, and when we are talking about the new lore that we're creating, what if Peter was a girl, it's Peony Pan. So Peter and Peony. And another thing to note, Peter Pan is no longer human. He stopped being human when he was 7 days old. He is now described as a betwixt and between, as we hear in The Little White Bird. So the very concept of trying to assign humanity, gender, labels and things like that onto a creature like Peter Pan is essentially redundant. And finally, in things to note before we start, for anyone who's about to get in the comments and go, but Peter says, I want always to be a little boy and to have fun, therefore he can't ever be a girl. Well, number one, get an imagination. And two, try reading the original source material again and get an idea of context. He says, I don't want ever to be a man. I want always to be a little boy and to have fun. The key word in what he's saying is the word boy, but it's not boy as opposed to girl. It's boy as opposed to man. The context of what is being said would be exactly the same if Peony Pan was saying, I want always to be a little girl and to have fun. Because the key here is child, not adult. Girl versus woman, boy versus man, not boy versus girl. So with all that wonderfulness in mind, let's dive into the question then. What would change if Peter Pan became Peony Pan? To begin with, Peony herself, I do not think would be any different to the character of Peter Pan. We're going to keep all the same characteristics, that cockiness, that joyfulness, that youth, that excitement, that adventure, the constantly forgetting, all of that would remain exactly the same. I see no reason at all why it would change. The backstory would also remain the same, hearing the parents talk about what you're going to be when you grow up, refusing to do so, flying away, going to Kensington Gardens, all of that would stay exactly the same. So the character of Peony and the character of Peter are pretty much the same. The effect of this change then is actually in what affects other characters in the story, and one of the big impacts is on Wendy Darling. Now you could go in two different directions with Wendy Darling. You could continue going in pretty much the same direction as the original lore, with Wendy Darling who is a little bit more grown up and very excited to grow up. She wants to be a wife and to have children. She's very nurturing and maternal. She could meet Peony Pan and still feel exactly the same way that she feels towards Peter. This would mean that the feelings she has that she doesn't quite understand from the adult world, the crush that she develops, all of those complicated feelings remain exactly the same. So the story would play out pretty much the same in that regard, except that instead of saying Peter, she would say Peony. They would do exactly the same things. She would offer a thimble as a kiss. They would exchange the acorn button and the thimble. The other direction you could go down is playing Wendy as, well, straight. And therefore she would not have that crush feeling on Peony Pan. Instead, she would see her as a friend, and at certain points in their relationship, much like Peter, a sort of child as well. One of the other characters you've got to think about is the character of Tinkerbell. Now you could keep her exactly the same and she could still feel for Peony and want to be the top person in Peony's life and could be very jealous of Wendy, and all of that could play out exactly the same way. You could also go in a slightly different direction and have it be a sort of, well, I want to be Peony's best friend, but you're encroaching on our territory, and then that jealousy is still there, just instead of it being a sort of romantic rivalry, it's more of a, I want to be the best friend, no, I want to be the best friend, that kind of thing. Or you could go in another direction and have there be no rivalry. Perhaps Tinkerbell does feel all those things for Peony, but if it's very apparent that Wendy does not, and Tinkerbell never saw her as a threat, there might have been no jealousy from Tinkerbell. And this has a bigger impact than you might realise, and we'll come back to it a few times through the story. So within this, there's a couple of scenarios. Wendy and Peony could exchange the thimble and the acorn button, or they could not. because Wendy may have no reason to offer Peony a kiss, pretending it's a thimble, etc, etc. Now, if Tinkerbell does get jealous of Wendy regardless, but Wendy feels platonically towards Peony, bear with me here, then Wendy would not have the acorn button, and so when Tinkerbell, in a jealous rage, got the Lost Boys to shoot at Wendy, Wendy would die. So there's a huge change right there that could well happen if you went down this route of the story. Alternatively, again, even if she doesn't exchange the acorn and the thimble and she doesn't have the acorn button, then Tinkerbell not being jealous means no one shoots at Wendy. And this means Wendy would never be knocked unconscious, Peter and the Lost Boys would never build the little Wendy house, and that absence of Wendy's little house, believe it or not, we will have to come back to a few times in this video, because if that little house is never built and does not exist on the Neverland, in this scenario of the story, there is a lot that could change. Hold fire for that a little bit later on, but let's go back to Wendy Darling. We'll talk more about this a little bit later on, but the final thing I want to say about Wendy is that even if she did have just platonic feelings towards Peony and they did become quite good friends, I feel that eventually Wendy and Peony would have a very similar argument to Wendy and Peter. She would realize that Peony, much like Peter, only sees her as a maternal figure and not as any sort of partner, and certainly nothing beyond the realms of make-believe. And ultimately this, much like it did in the original, would be what made Wendy decide to leave the Neverland. However, I think that in this context with Peony Pan, I think it might take Wendy a little longer to decide to leave. I think that without that feeling of that crush and wanting to grow up and explore that with Peter, because it's Peony and she doesn't want that, it would be a lot longer before she decided, actually, no, I'm sick of this. I feel that she could have that friendship and that could be built on for a lot longer before she grew sick of it, but ultimately she still would. Enough about Wendy Darling for now, though, and let's move on to the next character, and arguably the most impacted character by Peter becoming Peony. John Darling. I have talked a lot about John Darling in loads of videos over on TikTok and a few times here over on the YouTube channel. At some point I want to do a full video talking about him, but most of you will probably already know what I'm going to say, and that is that John Darling would be the most affected character by Peter becoming Peony, because, as most of us will hopefully know, John Darling has a terrible opinion of girls. He is the very epitome of a sexist man. He is described by Wendy Darling herself, his own sister, as saying that he despises girls, her included. So, taking all of that, John Darling's reaction to Peony Pan appearing in their nursery would not be very good. The first interaction that Peter and John have is while John Darling is asleep. Peter and Wendy have been talking, Peter has been buttering Wendy up a little bit, being very nice about girls, calling them very clever, etc. Wendy then says, "It's such a lovely way that you talk about girls," and then she points to her own brother and says, "John there just despises us." Peter then, and I think Peony would do exactly the same thing, gets up and kicks John out of bed in outrage at this. Wendy then says, you're not captain here, but John is still asleep, so she does let it slide, and as she says, he was trying to be kind. I think that Peony would do this too. She would still have to win Wendy over after having the cocky outburst over the shadow, forgetting to thank Wendy, so saying all these lovely things about Wendy would still happen, but instead of it being, "Oh, I'm so surprised you're being nice about girls," because Peony is one, Wendy would simply just say, "It's so nice to have another girl to talk to, John just despises us," or something like that. Peony would then go over, kick John out of bed, and exactly the same thing would happen. Then, later on, Wendy would say, "Can you teach John and Michael to fly too?" Peony would say yes, and Wendy would wake her brothers up. And so, we join John Darling, the sexist misogynist that he is, waking up on the floor of his bedroom, and standing over him is his older sister, who he does not respect. And there's a strange other girl there too. And they're saying, wake up, Peony Pan is here and she's going to teach us how to fly." This would not sit right with John immediately. One of the big things I think John would straight away feel is this feeling of being outnumbered. John is being woken up by this magical, ethereal creature, and she is going to teach him something. So instead of being excited like he was for Peter, I feel like there'd be a little bit of almost annoyance that there's a girl doing it and something that he can't, that kind of thing. So his bias towards Peony would show a little bit as he was reserved, but he would still get up and want to learn how to fly. He would still take charge in that moment where Liza and Nana come back up into the nursery, but I think he would do it in a much bigger way, as if I'm supposed to be in charge, obviously. I also think that a lot of the behavior that John puts up with Peter, he would find a lot more irritating in a girl. So for example, when in the original, Peter lets them try to fly with their happy thoughts, but laughs at them because he hasn't given them the fairy dust yet, then sprinkles it on them and they are of course able to fly. In this version with Peony Pan doing this, where she is laughing at him, John would take that much more to heart. It would continue on the flight to the Neverland as well, with all of the behaviour that we saw in the original Peter Pan would still be there in Peony, and John would be finding it even more annoying. In the original, he tells Wendy he wants Peter to stop showing off. In this, I think he would see it as more than that, worse than that, and I think he'd be a lot ruder about it. And then in the moments where Peony would be leaving and forgetting about them, going on adventures and coming back, he would be even more riled up about this. Almost in a, see, this is why girls shouldn't be leading, we can't follow them, this is ridiculous kind of way. And I feel like he would definitely want to try and take charge, even though he can't. And that irritation that Peony is so much better and faster than he is, that would really sink in as well. He would probably see Peony Pan as a silly girl they're better off without. And then a really big moment would happen. As in the original, as they're flying over the Neverland, Peter looks down and tells John that there's a pirate asleep in the woods just beneath them, and if he likes, they can go down and kill him. I think that Peony Pan would offer the same adventure to John, and he would have a similar reaction, but for a slightly different reason. In this one, he would also have that feeling of his authority and his respect being challenged, so of course he would want to go down and kill a pirate. But he still has that air of he's never actually killed anyone before, and so his fear would show, much as he would hate it. So, much like in the original, John would say, but suppose he were to wake up? To which Peony would respond the same way that Peter did, saying, well, of course I'm going to wake him up. You don't think I'd kill them without waking them up? And this, to John, again, is just that big stab to the heart of his masculinity, that big clawing of resentment building up, a challenge to his authority, calling him a coward, essentially. And remember, there's that insult that the parents use mockingly with each other of cowardy, cowardy custard. He would probably be hearing that in his head at this point. Even though Peony has not said it, in John's head, she is calling him a cowardy custard. This would all continue to bubble over, this big cauldron of resentment inside John Darling just building and building. And we will come back to John Darling a little bit later on. But for now, let's move on with the story and what else might change. One of the other big things that might change is what happens on Marooners Rock. All the time leading up to it would be pretty much the same. Peony Pan, much like Peter, would still rescue Tiger Lily, imitating Hook. They would still start fighting the pirates. All of this would still happen. But the bit we need to focus on is where Peony and Wendy are left on Marooners Rock, unable to fly, unable to swim, and the tide is rising. They are going to drown. Now, the change happens when the Kite arrives, because in the original story, the Kite arrives and they realize it could carry one of them to safety, but not two. Wendy then offers to draw lots, and Peter says, "You a lady? Never!" and ties the kite around her and sends her away. In this version, there's a couple of different routes you could go down. Number one is Wendy, as always, says, well, let's draw lots. Peony agrees. Wendy still wins and flies away on the kite. Option 2, they draw lots. Peony wins. And then Wendy is left on the rock as Peony is blown away on the kite. And I don't think the Neverbird would necessarily come to save Wendy. They don't know each other. There's no reason for her to. So Wendy Darling could die. This is the second time that Peter becoming Peony means that Wendy might die. So let's talk about the final idea for this scene then. And again, remembering that Peter and Peony have exactly the same personality, I don't think Peony would let them draw lots. No way at all. And it wouldn't be because, but you're a lady. It might be because, but you're our mother. But also it might just be, no, I'm not letting you die for me. No matter what Wendy suggests, Wendy is getting on that kite and being flown away to safety. The rest of the scene would then carry on as in the original lore. To die would be an awfully big adventure. The Neverbird rocks up because of those caring feelings she has towards Peony, gets in the nest, the eggs are saved, everyone's saved, the end. Coming back now then to the Wendy and Peony final disagreement. The reason that Wendy decides to leave the Neverland. Now, as I've said, I think it would take longer for this to happen. I think that particularly if Wendy and Peony were very platonic, even though they would be acting as sort of parental figures to the Lost Boys and parent and mother figures to the Lost Boys, that would all still happen in a very similar way to the original. But if there was none of this, oh, I have a crush and these weird feelings from Wendy, then I think she would have stayed a lot longer because that friendship could have survived it. But ultimately, she would still realize that, oh, I'm forgetting things and I do want to grow up and I do want to have a family and this is all still pretend. She would ask Peony, what are you to me? Peony would say, a devoted child, devoted daughter. And Wendy would realize it's all just going to continue to be pretend. I want to go home. Peony would also still tell the story of the past, like Peter does, the story of the barred window and how she was forgotten by the family, and this again would spur Wendy into action, and all the Lost Boys, Wendy, John and Michael, would set off to go home. And this leads us very nicely into another big moment that could change if Peter became Peony. And this is when Captain Hook and all of the pirates come to kidnap the children outside of the home under the ground. The thing that's going to cause the big change here is, I said we'd come back to it, if Wendy's little house was never built. But how does this change the pirates' kidnapping? Well, there's a couple of different things that this could change, and it is all about how the children are carried to the pirate ship. So in the original lore, they are all tied up individually, bundled into the little house, and then they carry the little house on the backs of the pirates all the way to the pirate ship. However, in this, there is no little house, so how are they going to do it? Well, there are two options that I see here. Option number one, they still tie the children up, fling them over their backs like sacks, and each pirate sort of carries one each, and they walk them to the ship like that. Option number two is they don't bother with the rope at all, and they just fling them over their backs and carry them like this. One of these options leads to the story happening in pretty much the same way. Hook poisons the medicine cup, Tinkerbell drinks it, has to be brought back to life. The other option means Captain Hook never poisons the medicine cup, Tinkerbell never drinks it, and Captain Hook might survive the rest of the story. It all comes down to whether or not the pirates tie up the children. Now, what the pirates did is they took equal lengths of rope and they tied each child up with them. The upshot of this is Captain Hook noticing that Slightly is bigger than the other children. He realizes that because of this, he himself could fit down Slightly's tree. He then goes down and manages to poison the medicine cup, thus setting in motion the rest of the string of events. However, if they never bother to tie up the children and just carry them to the ship one at a time, kicking and screaming, Captain Hook may never notice that Slightly is bigger than the other boys, and so never gets the idea to go down the tree and never poisons the medicine cup. Something to remember within that scenario is that if Tinkerbell doesn't die and doesn't need to be revived, I don't think Peony Pan would swear, as Peter did, Hook or me this time. Bear that in mind for a little bit later on in the story. I do think, though, that the pirates would still tie up the children so Hook would notice. I mostly think they tie them up because, well, these kids can fly, and it's going to be a lot easier to hold on to them if they're not going to fly away from your clutches every few minutes. Later on the pirate ship, they are all put in chains as well, so they can't fly away, so I reckon they probably would tie them up, so the poisoning would probably still happen. But for the fun of it, we will explore different angles. So remember for later on, what if Peony doesn't swear Hook or me? In terms of Peony and Captain Hook, most of their interactions probably wouldn't change. Hook would still call Peony a proud and insolent youth, Peony would still call Hook a dark and sinister man, they would still have had the same history, Peony would have sliced off Hook's hand, fed it to the crocodile, still have a hook, they would still fight, they would still be foes, all of this would be exactly the same. I do want to mention at this point that there is a sad truth that we cannot really escape from, which is that if Peter was Peony Pan, then the dynamic does just, to an outside observer, feel a bit worse. Because what you end up with, in effect, is a grown adult man chasing around a little girl. So that is something I did want to quickly mention. I'm not ignoring that, and we cannot really escape the fact that that would be something we would have to deal with as viewers to this story. Before we get into what would happen at the end of Captain Hook's life in this story and the end of the fight on the Jolly Roger, I want to take us woodly-woodly-wooing back to John Darling. I said he'd come up again, and he has. And this is arguably the biggest change in the story. So, before Peter comes to rescue the children on the Jolly Roger, Captain Hook, thinking Peter has been poisoned, is in his hour of triumph. He has chained all the children up, including Wendy, and they are all going to be made to walk the plank. But, he says to them, I have room for 2 cabin boys, so which of you is it to be? Some of the Lost Boys start arguing amongst each other, saying things like, oh, I don't think my mother would want me to be a pirate, trying to get out of it. But then, Captain Hook singles out John Darling. He says, you look as if you have a bit of pluck in you. Didst ever want to be a pirate, my hearty? To which John says to the captain, I once thought of calling myself Red-Handed Jack. And Captain Hook says, a fine name, we would call you that if you joined us. Then John and Michael have a discussion. Michael asks, what would I be called? Captain Hook says, Blackbeard Joe. They then discuss, should we do it? Should we become pirates? And of course, you can forgive them a little bit for this because they are trying to save their own lives from walking the plank. But ultimately, in the original law, they turn it down because John asks if they would still be respectful subjects of the king, and Captain Hook says, no, you would have to swear down with the king. And so they have a sort of fine moment where they both say, well, I refuse, and they sort of shine out in that moment. However, I think in this version of the story, that would completely change. I think the same things would happen in the build-up. The children will all be chained, they're going to walk the plank, and then Captain Hook would say, I've got room for 2 cabin boys, which of you is it to be? They'd start arguing, and then, as in the original, he would single out John Darling and say, you boy, you look as if you've got a bit of pluck in you. Didst ever want to be a pirate, my hearty? To which John would have an instant feeling of gratitude. Finally, to him, in this moment, a man is here and he is giving him respect. Think back to all of the things that John will have experienced. He doesn't like Peony, he doesn't like girls, he's been having to follow this girl who he sees as chaotic and silly. He has been having to be subservient to this girl. At this point, he probably feels like the island is bloody full of girls. You've got the mermaids and Tinkerbell, some fairies, you've got Wendy and Peony, you've got Tiger Lily, and Tiger Lily, of course, will have been protecting them after Peony saved her life. So all of this, John will have hated so much, this resentment bubbling up. Another thing that John will be thinking in this moment is, of course, I'm about to die because of Peony, because of a silly girl. I'm not dying because of a girl. And finally, here he has this man who he sees as less chaotic and not silly. And bear in mind the parallels between Captain Hook and Mr. Darling, though Mr. Darling has at home changed completely, but John doesn't know this. This is a proper father figure, someone who's stoic and serious and seems to John, at least, to have a lot of the same sort of ideas that he does. And at the very least, it's a man giving him respect. That will mean a lot to John Darling in this moment, to have been singled out. So he will say the same thing. Well, I once thought of calling myself Red-Handed Jack. And Captain Hook will say the same thing. A good name too. We'll call you that if you join us. And I don't think at this point John would turn to his brother. I think at this point John would agree and say, yes, I want to become a pirate. And I don't think that Michael would necessarily go with him, and I don't necessarily think that John would invite him. He might try, but ultimately Michael will probably still stay with his sister. And as they're all staring open-mouthed as John is released from his chains and stands there, is maybe handed a sword, given maybe a red bandana to wear as Red-Handed Jack, he stands there with the pirates and turns, and he is now against his brother, his sister, and the rest of the Lost Boys. All of this culminates in the big fight on the Jolly Roger. Now, there's a lot of different scenarios at play here, so let's go through them one at a time. Option 1, the poisoning happened. Hook or me, the oath has been sworn. So all the fighting happens in pretty much the same way. The pirates are defeated, Peony and Captain Hook have their final fight, and then Hook throws himself to the crocodile. In this scenario, John Darling would fight on the side of the pirates, but then he would either turn, realizing the error of his ways, or, more likely, realizing he is on the losing side and go back to the Lost Boys. The other option is what would happen if the poisoning never happened. And this one is even more interesting. So if the poison is never put in the medicine cup, Tinkerbell doesn't drink it, Peony doesn't need to save her, then Peony is probably not in a heightened enough state of emotion to swear Hook or me this time. Meaning that, going by the original law, because it does reference this, Peony would sneak onto the pirate ship, unchain all of the Lost Boys, and then fly away. It says it in the original law. The oath has boarded the ship with Peter, Hook or me this time, and they could have flown away, but he couldn't because he'd sworn to follow through on that oath. But in this scenario, Peony never did. There was no oath, so they could just fly away. And this is the bit that gets extremely interesting because John Darling has joined the pirates, is not chained up, and therefore might get left behind. Either accidentally because they just don't realize he's not there till it's too late, or deliberately on their part because they choose to leave him, or deliberately because he chooses to stay behind. They might offer to take him with them. Wendy and Michael in particular might assume, of course you're going to come with us. Now that Peony's saved us, come on, we're going to go home. And John might say, no, I'm not going with you. I'm staying here with this man who respects me. I'm gonna be a pirate. I am Red-Handed Jack. And we will come back to that version of John Darling at the very end of this video. So, moving on to the rest of the story for now. Now we come to the return home and the end of the story. So the events would unfold in pretty much the same way. If the Jolly Roger had been taken over by the children, they would sail it to the Azores and then fly back to London. If they had just flown away from the Jolly Roger, then they would simply fly all the way back to London. So either way, they still journey back to London. They all get adopted by Mr. and Mrs. Darling. Mrs. Darling would offer to adopt Peony as well, saying that she would be a daughter and she would grow up and she would go to school. Peony would of course still say no, but still agree to come back and visit Wendy for spring cleaning and then ultimately visit Wendy's descendants through the years as well. So all of the story with Wendy and Peony at this point is pretty much the same as it was for Wendy and Peter. It is ultimately John Darling whose ending could be completely drastically altered. So let's wrap this video up by looking at all the endings for John Darling. Option 1, if John Darling returned with them. Maybe he had decided to rejoin them, maybe he had to, for whichever reason he has joined back with them and he has sailed and come home. Now, Wendy and her brother might be slightly more forgiving than the rest of the Lost Boys, and it would take a little while, but eventually they could. And in one scenario, John really does change his behaviour. A lot of this to do with not just their outrage at him, but also to do with his father. When they get home, he would see how much his father has changed, how much effort he's put into, and how much of a better man he is. And because he respects his father so much, that could have a real impact on John Darling, and he could decide, oh no, I need to change as well, taking it all deeply to heart, looking back over his actions, and ultimately becoming a much better person. That is, let's call it the good ending for John Darling, the hopeful, the best ending, where he becomes a much nicer, kinder, better person. All of that sexism has gone. He is just much, much better to everyone, especially his sister. Option number 2 is that John still comes home with them, but because he had to. He realised he was on the losing side or was defeated with the rest of the pirates, but still was invited by particularly Wendy and his brother to come home with them, and so he did. But bear in mind, they will have sailed on the Jolly Roger most of the way back home, and of course, Peony is the captain. And again, there's that niggle in John Darling of a girl, a silly girl in charge. I can't believe it. We followed her here. She has led us into trouble. I've nearly died for you so many times. That will be a big thing that he'll be thinking. I nearly died because of you. I can't believe it. You're still here. Almost taking over from Captain Hook in that feeling of that niggle, that annoying fly that I just want to swat this silly, irritating, cocky girl. And that would sit with him and sting him, and he wouldn't be able to drop it. He would get home and see that his father has changed, and in John's opinion, he would have gotten weaker, and his respect for his father would completely be shattered. His worldview is going completely upside down. Peony keeps coming back over the years, visiting Wendy and her daughters. What is it with this silly, silly girl? And John, being one of the oldest as well, means that he stops believing first, so the power to fly would leave him first. So he's again left out of all this stuff the others are still clinging on to and can do. Maybe they discuss their adventures excitedly and John doesn't want to think about it. Maybe they're starting to fade from his mind. And ultimately, much like it says in the original lore, John would grow up into the bearded man who doesn't know any stories to tell his children. We'll call that bad ending 1 for John Darling. And now let's talk about what would happen if John had not come home with them. In this scenario, either the pirates were defeated but John stayed anyway, or the children flew away and John refused to go with them. So John has stayed on the pirate ship. So John is either left there on the Jolly Roger with the remnants of Hook's crew, or with Captain Hook himself and most of the pirates. And in this version of the story, John would continue to sail with them. Starting as cabin boy, he might not immediately get the respect he hoped for and wanted, but he would work hard, he would rise through the ranks, and ultimately I think he could end up becoming a second in command, even possibly taking over for Captain Hook one day. Whether this was years down the line after he'd been trained up by the man, or if Captain Hook had flung himself to the crocodile and John had watched Peony cause all of this, he might almost immediately take over for Captain Hook. All that hatred, that niggling feeling, it would rise up like bile in him, and within a few short years, I think he could end up becoming even worse than Captain Hook. So that is bad ending number 2 for John Darling. Which of John's endings do you think is most likely to happen? Let me know in the comments down below. So that wraps up this interesting question of what if Peter was a girl? I have loved delving into this, and I still have so many ideas that I just didn't have time to fit into this video. So let me know what you think down in the comments below, and which of the different plot points do you think would happen? Do you think that the poisoning would happen? Do you think that Tink and Wendy would still have the rivalry? Would Wendy die? At which point would she die? All these different scenarios. What do you think would happen with John Darling? Let me know in the comments down below. As ever, if you have any other questions, chuck them in the comments, chuck them into the TikTok page, and I will try to answer them as soon as I possibly can. Don't forget to hydrate and feed yourselves. And also, please remember, the world is as magical as you think it is. Goodbye, until next time.